Stand there and smile because that is all I need from you tonight." The words landed harder than the soft music floating through the grand ballroom of the Royal Crescent Hotel. Conversation slowed. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to waiting hands. A few guests looked toward the sound, then quickly looked away again. Nathaniel Royce, the white billionaire chief executive officer whose companies shaped skylines and filled financial headlines, stood in the center of the charity gala with his shoulders straight and his expression cold. Across from him stood his pregnant wife, Evelyn Royce, her elegant blue gown catching the light from the chandeliers above, while one hand rested gently against her stomach. She lowered her eyes and forced a small smile. The kind people where when they hope a difficult moment will disappear before anyone notices. The problem was that everyone noticed. Hundreds of people filled the ballroom. Business leaders, politicians, investors, television personalities. They had all come to celebrate a record-breaking fundraiser, and many of them owed Nathaniel Royce a favor, a contract, or a future opportunity. Nobody wanted to risk any of that. So they looked at the flowers on the tables. They adjusted their jackets. They whispered to one another about the weather. Anything except the couple standing beneath the brightest lights in the room. Near the back of the ballroom, Amara Lewis balanced a silver tray filled with sparkling water and glasses. At 25 years old, the black waitress had worked enough events to understand the strange rules of expensive places. Wealthy people could fill a room with noise and somehow make silence feel even louder. She moved between tables with practiced grace, making sure every guest had what they needed while trying not to interrupt private conversations. But Nathaniel Royce was no longer speaking quietly. He took one slow step closer to Evelyn and lowered his voice just enough that the people nearest could hear every word. "You had one job tonight," he said. Evelyn swallowed and nodded gently. "I know. I am sorry." Amara stopped walking. She was close enough to see that Evelyn looked tired. The long evening had left her pale, and her smile seemed to take effort. A nearby guest reached for another drink without taking his eyes off the scene. Another woman looked ready to stand, then sat back down when she recognized who Nathaniel Royce was. Amara had never met the billionaire before that night, but she knew his face. Everyone in New York knew his face. Magazine covers called him fearless. Television hosts called him brilliant. Employees called him demanding. Standing only a few yards away, Amara noticed something different. She noticed that the most powerful man in the room seemed far more interested in controlling the moment than caring about the woman beside him. Evelyn shifted her weight and quietly reached for the back of a chair. Nathaniel noticed and frowned. "Please do not make this evening any more difficult than it already is," he said. The words were calm, but the room somehow felt colder. Amara looked around the ballroom. Surely someone would step forward. A family member, a friend, a doctor, one of the board members, someone. But the crowd remained perfectly still. In that moment, with a silver tray in her hands and a ballroom full of silent witnesses around her, Amara Lewis realized that the loneliest person in the room was not the waitress everyone ignored. It was the woman standing beside one of the richest men in America, waiting for a single person to remember that she mattered. Evelyn Royce kept her hand against the back of the chair for a second longer before slowly letting it go. She straightened her shoulders and gave the kind of smile that fooled strangers but never fooled people who were paying attention. Nathaniel Royce adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit jacket and looked around the ballroom as though nothing unusual had happened. The orchestra continued to play soft music. Servers carried elegant plates from one table to another. Photographers waited near the stage for the charity presentation to begin. The evening moved forward because wealthy rooms had a strange talent for pretending uncomfortable moments had never happened. Amara Lewis wished she could do the same. She picked up her silver tray and walked toward another table, but her eyes kept drifting back to Evelyn. The pregnant woman was speaking politely with a group of guests, nodding at the right moments and thanking them for their kind words. Yet every few seconds, she quietly touched her stomach and took a slow breath, as though she was trying to stay calm for someone much smaller than herself. Amara had seen that look before. Her mother used to wear it during difficult days. Smile first, worry later. Keep everyone else comfortable, even if you are not. A man at one of the tables asked Amara for another glass of sparkling water. She poured it with a steady hand and thanked him. Another guest complimented the decorations. Someone else laughed about the stock market. The ordinary conversations of the evening floated around her, but none of them felt real anymore. Near the center of the ballroom, Nathaniel spoke with investors while Evelyn stood quietly beside him. She looked more like part of the display than part of the conversation. Every time someone greeted Nathaniel, he answered with confidence. Every time someone greeted Evelyn, she smiled warmly and let him take over the discussion. Amara noticed something else. Nathaniel rarely looked at his wife. He looked at clients. He looked at board members. He looked at reporters. But when Evelyn tried to say something to him, his attention shifted away almost immediately. The room noticed it too. They simply chose not to mention it. A gray-haired woman sitting near the stage watched Evelyn with concern. A younger couple exchanged uncertain glances. Even one of the musicians looked toward the ballroom floor for a moment before returning to his performance. The silence was spreading through the room like an invisible thread connecting everyone together. Amara carried another tray toward the refreshment station. Her manager smiled and reminded the staff to keep moving because the main presentation would begin soon. Amara nodded, but her thoughts stayed with Evelyn. She looked across the ballroom again and saw the pregnant woman reach for a chair once more. Nathaniel leaned close and quietly said something that made Evelyn stop and pull her hand away. She stood straight again and forced another smile for the people around her. Amara felt a knot forming in her chest. She did not know the whole story. She did not know what kind of marriage Nathaniel and Evelyn had when nobody else was around. She only knew what she could see. A tired woman trying to stay graceful. A powerful man who seemed more concerned about appearances than comfort. A ballroom full of successful people waiting for someone else to do the right thing. Amara looked around one more time, hoping that a friend or family member would step forward and ask Evelyn if she was all right. Nobody moved. The orchestra played another song. The master of ceremonies announced that the evening's biggest donors would soon be recognized. Nathaniel adjusted his tie and prepared to walk toward the stage. Evelyn took a careful breath and followed him, and Amara realized with growing unease that the night was not getting easier. It was only beginning, and somehow the distance between doing her job and doing what was right felt smaller with every passing minute. Evelyn Royce followed Nathaniel toward the front of the ballroom with slow and careful steps, keeping one hand lightly against the side of her gown as though reminding herself to breathe. The bright stage lights reflected across the polished floor, and hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the couple who had become the faces of the evening's charity event. Nathaniel walked with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life believing every room would make space for him. Evelyn walked with the quiet grace of someone trying not to become the center of attention. Amara Lewis stood near the refreshment table with a silver tray resting against her arm, watching the scene unfold. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and thanked Nathaniel Royce for his generous support of the hospital foundation. The audience applauded warmly. Nathaniel smiled for the cameras and accepted the attention with ease. Beside him, Evelyn smiled as well, but Amara noticed that her smile faded the moment the flashes of the cameras stopped. Nathaniel leaned toward his wife and quietly said something. From where Amara stood, she could not hear the words, but she saw Evelyn nod almost immediately. A photographer raised a camera and called for another picture. Nathaniel placed an arm around Evelyn's shoulders. She stood perfectly still and looked toward the crowd. The moment the picture was taken, Nathaniel stepped away and began talking to a group of investors without waiting for her. Evelyn remained standing alone for a few seconds before slowly moving toward a nearby table. Amara picked up a pitcher of water and walked across the ballroom. As she reached Evelyn, she offered a gentle smile. "Would you like some water, ma'am?" Evelyn looked surprised for a moment, then smiled back. "Yes, thank you." Her voice was soft and kind. Amara poured the glass and noticed that Evelyn's hands trembled ever so slightly as she accepted it. "Thank you for asking," Evelyn said quietly. "It has been a long evening." Before Amara could answer, Nathaniel's voice carried across the room. "Evelyn." The single word was not loud, but it was sharp enough to make several nearby guests glance in their direction. Evelyn quickly placed the glass on the table and turned back toward her husband. Nathaniel walked over with a polite smile fixed on his face. "There you are," he said. "People are waiting for us." Evelyn apologized softly and started walking beside him. Amara watched them disappear into another circle of guests. She noticed that Evelyn had barely touched the water. Nearby, two women whispered to each other. One shook her head with concern. The other looked toward Nathaniel and quickly changed the subject. Across the ballroom, board members laughed over business stories while reporters prepared for more interviews. The evening carried on, but the uneasy feeling in Amara's chest continued to grow. She remembered something her mother used to say. Sometimes the hardest person to help is the one surrounded by people. The words stayed with her as she returned to her work. A few minutes later, she looked toward the balcony doors and saw Evelyn standing alone for a brief moment, enjoying the quiet away from the crowd. The pregnant woman closed her eyes and took a slow breath of fresh air. Nathaniel noticed and walked toward her. His expression was calm, but serious. They began talking. Evelyn nodded once, then twice. Then she lowered her eyes. Amara could not hear the conversation, but she could see enough to know that Evelyn was no longer enjoying the evening. One by one, nearby guests noticed the same thing. One by one, they looked away. Standing in the middle of a ballroom filled with successful and respected people, Amara realized that the room had become divided into two kinds of strangers, the ones who saw what was happening and the ones who pretended they did not. And she was beginning to wonder which choice would stay with her longer after the night was over. Evelyn Roy stood on the balcony for only a minute before Nathaniel joined her. But somehow that single minute looked like the first peaceful moment she had enjoyed all evening. The cool New York air moved gently through the open space, carrying the distant sounds of traffic far below the luxury hotel. Inside the ballroom, music and laughter continued as though the world had no problems at all. Outside, beneath the soft lights hanging above the terrace, Evelyn closed her eyes and rested one hand against the railing while the other remained over her stomach. Amara Lewis watched from the open doorway as she carried a tray of fresh glasses toward the outdoor refreshment station. She told herself to focus on work. Refill the water pitchers. Clear the empty plates. Stay professional. Yet something about the scene before her refused to let her look away. Nathaniel stopped a few feet from Evelyn and folded his arms. He spoke quietly, but his expression was serious. Evelyn answered with a small nod. She seemed to apologize for something Amara could not understand. Nathaniel shook his head and looked back toward the ballroom, where photographers and business leaders waited for the next part of the evening. Evelyn spoke again. Nathaniel interrupted her. Even from across the terrace, Amara could see the change in Evelyn's face. Her shoulders lowered. Her smile disappeared. She looked down at the floor for a moment before looking back at her husband. Two guests standing near the balcony doors noticed the conversation. One of them whispered something to the other. Both quietly walked back inside. Nobody wanted to become involved. Amara remembered the first lesson her grandmother had taught her when she started working. You can learn everything about a room by seeing what people pretend not to notice. Tonight the ballroom was teaching her a difficult lesson. Wealth did not always create courage. Sometimes it created fear. A server beside Amara quietly asked if everything was all right. Amara forced a smile and nodded. She carried a pitcher of water onto the terrace and placed it on a nearby table. Evelyn noticed her and offered a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly. Nathaniel looked toward Amara for only a second before returning his attention to Evelyn. "We need to go back inside," he said. "People are waiting." Evelyn took a slow breath. "I just need a moment." Nathaniel checked his watch and looked toward the ballroom again. "This evening is important. Please do not make this more difficult than it has to be." His words were calm, but they carried a weight that made the silence around them feel heavier. Evelyn looked toward the city lights stretching across the dark sky. Amara noticed that she seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. She wanted to say something kind. Offer another glass of water. Ask if she needed a chair. But the invisible line between guest and staff held her back. Nathaniel stepped toward the ballroom entrance and expected Evelyn to follow. She started walking, then paused for a brief second as though trying to catch her breath. Amara instinctively took one step forward. Before she could say anything, Evelyn smiled politely and continued walking. The smile did not reach her eyes. Inside the ballroom, the master of ceremonies announced that the final presentation of the evening would begin in just a few minutes. Guests returned to their seats. Cameras were lifted once again. Nathaniel walked confidently toward the center of the room. Evelyn followed beside him with quiet dignity. Amara stood near the doorway holding an empty tray and looked around at the hundreds of people filling the grand hall. Doctors, lawyers, executives, community leaders, and respected families had all gathered to celebrate generosity and compassion. Yet the person who seemed to need the simplest act of kindness that night was walking through the crowd completely alone, and Amara could not shake the feeling that before the evening ended someone would have to decide whether being polite was more important than being brave. Evelyn Royce returned to the ballroom beside Nathaniel with the same quiet smile she had worn all evening, but Amara Lewis could see that each step seemed a little slower than the last. The guests stood and applauded as the final part of the charity program began. Bright lights swept across the stage. Cameras flashed. The master of ceremonies welcomed the biggest donors of the night and invited Nathaniel and Evelyn to take their places near the front of the room. Nathaniel walked forward with his usual confidence, greeting business partners and community leaders with a warm handshake. Evelyn stayed close behind him, offering polite smiles to everyone she met. Amara carried a tray of sparkling water through the crowd and watched from a respectful distance. She noticed that Evelyn had not eaten much during the evening and had barely touched the water she had been given. The ballroom felt warmer now, crowded with people moving from one conversation to another. Soft music played in the background while waiters and waitresses hurried between the tables. A doctor from the hospital foundation stopped to congratulate Nathaniel on his support for the new family health center. Nathaniel thanked him and immediately turned to answer a question from a television reporter. Evelyn waited quietly beside him. A few moments later, she gently reached toward Nathaniel and said something that Amara could not hear. Nathaniel looked at his watch before answering. His expression tightened for only a second. Evelyn nodded and stepped back without saying another word. The doctor noticed the exchange and looked at Evelyn with concern, but another guest called his name and he walked away. Amara felt the same uneasy feeling return to her chest. She moved closer to the refreshment table and picked up a glass of water. As Evelyn passed nearby, Amara offered it with a smile. "Ma'am, would you like some water?" Evelyn accepted the glass gratefully. "Thank you. That is very kind of you." Before she could take more than a small sip, Nathaniel looked over and motioned for her to come back. "We need to be ready for the photographs," he said. Evelyn placed the glass on the nearest table and quietly followed him. Amara watched the untouched water sparkle beneath the ballroom lights. Nearby, two older guests exchanged worried looks. One of them stood as though he wanted to walk over to Evelyn, but his companion gently touched his arm and shook her head. The silent message was clear: do not get involved. The master of ceremonies invited Nathaniel and Evelyn onto the stage for a special recognition. Applause filled the room once again. Nathaniel thanked the audience for supporting families and children across the city. Evelyn stood beside him with one hand resting lightly against her stomach. As the applause continued, Amara noticed Evelyn shift her weight slightly and take a slow breath. She smiled for the cameras, but the smile looked tired. Nathaniel leaned toward her and quietly said something. Evelyn nodded immediately and straightened her posture. The cameras flashed again. Amara glanced around the ballroom. Hundreds of successful and respected people were celebrating generosity, kindness, and community. Yet the woman standing beneath the brightest lights looked as though she needed a simple moment to rest. Grace Whitman, the event manager, stood near the stage checking her schedule. She looked toward Evelyn for a second and frowned before returning to her work. Amara realized that she was not the only person noticing what was happening anymore. More eyes were beginning to follow Evelyn. More whispers were moving through the crowd. The evening that had started with polite smiles and careful silence was slowly changing. Nathaniel finished his speech and reached for Evelyn's hand to lead her down from the stage. She took one careful step forward, paused for a brief moment to steady herself, and looked around the crowded ballroom as though searching for a friendly face. And when her eyes unexpectedly met Amara's across the room, Amara understood that sometimes the smallest act of kindness begins with nothing more than letting another person know they are not alone. Evelyn Royce held Nathaniel's hand as they stepped down from the stage, but Amara Lewis noticed that the smile she had offered the audience was fading. The applause slowly disappeared behind polite conversations as guests returned to their tables. A string quartet began another soft melody. Servers moved through the ballroom, carrying desserts and coffee. The charity gala was supposed to be reaching its happiest moment, yet Amara could not forget the look Evelyn had given her from the stage. It was not a look of fear. It was something quieter. It was the expression of someone trying very hard to stay strong. Amara picked up a tray of sparkling water and walked toward the center of the ballroom. Grace Whitman, the event manager, hurried past her checking the schedule for the final speeches. Volunteers adjusted decorations. Photographers searched for their next picture. The room was full of movement, but Evelyn seemed to move more slowly than everyone else. She stood beside Nathaniel while he spoke with a group of board members. One investor congratulated the couple on their growing family. Evelyn thanked him warmly. Nathaniel smiled for the conversation, but his attention stayed on business. Another guest invited the couple to join a photograph near the grand staircase. Nathaniel agreed immediately. Evelyn took a careful breath before following him. Amara carried fresh drinks toward the staircase and arrived just as the photographer was arranging everyone into position. Nathaniel stood tall in the center. Evelyn stepped beside him and smiled for the camera. The bright lights flashed several times. When the pictures were finished, Evelyn quietly reached for the railing of the staircase for support. Nathaniel noticed and leaned toward her. "We still have a few more guests to greet," he said softly. Evelyn nodded. "I know. I just need a minute." Nathaniel looked around the crowded ballroom and lowered his voice even more. "Please try to keep going. Everyone is watching." Evelyn looked at the floor for a second before answering. "I am trying." Amara stood only a few feet away pretending to organize the refreshment table, but every word stayed with her. Grace Whitman looked toward the staircase and slowed her pace. She seemed ready to walk over, then stopped when another staff member called her name. The moment passed. Evelyn took another careful step and continued greeting guests. A kind older woman noticed that she looked tired and offered her a chair. Before Evelyn could answer, Nathaniel politely thanked the woman and explained that they had a few more responsibilities before the evening ended. The guest smiled and stepped away. Amara felt the knot in her chest grow tighter. She poured another glass of water and carried it toward Evelyn. "Ma'am, I thought you might like this." Evelyn looked at her with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. You have been very thoughtful tonight." She accepted the glass and finally took a long drink. Nathaniel checked his watch again. "We need to meet the foundation directors," he said. Evelyn placed the half-empty glass on the table and nodded. Amara looked at the untouched water and wished Evelyn had been able to finish it. The ballroom doors opened and more important guests arrived for the final reception. Nathaniel adjusted his jacket and prepared to welcome them. Evelyn stood beside him, smoothing her gown and taking one slow breath after another. Grace Whitman walked by and glanced toward Evelyn with concern. The older woman from the staircase looked over from across the room. Even the photographer lowered his camera for a moment. More people were beginning to notice what Amara had seen from the very beginning. The difference was that nobody seemed certain what to do about it. Amara stood quietly with her silver tray and looked around the beautiful ballroom, filled with generous donors and respected leaders. She realized that courage did not always arrive with a loud voice or a grand speech. Sometimes it began with a simple decision to care about another person, and as she watched Evelyn quietly steady herself before another long line of greetings, Amara could feel that decision waiting for her just beyond the next moment of silence. Evelyn Roy smiled at another guest, thanked her for coming to the charity gala, and took one careful step forward before quietly stopping. The grand ballroom of the Royal Crescent Hotel was still filled with music and conversation, but Amara Lewis noticed something had changed. Evelyn's smile was fading again. She placed one hand against her stomach and the other against the edge of a nearby table, taking a slow breath as though she simply needed a moment to collect herself. Nathaniel Royce was speaking with a group of foundation directors only a few feet away. One of them asked a question about the company's newest community project, and Nathaniel answered with his usual confidence. He glanced toward Evelyn and motioned for her to come closer. Evelyn tried to walk toward him, but her steps were slower now. Amara picked up a fresh glass of water and moved through the crowd. She could feel more eyes watching Evelyn than before. The older woman from the staircase noticed. Grace Whitman noticed. Even the doctor from the hospital foundation looked in Evelyn's direction with quiet concern. Nathaniel smiled politely at the people around him. "Evelyn, we are about to greet the next group of guests." Evelyn nodded and gave a small smile. "I know. I just need a short break." Nathaniel lowered his voice. "We are almost finished. Please stay with me a little longer." His words were calm, but Amara could hear the pressure hidden beneath them. Evelyn looked down for a second before answering. "I am doing my best." Amara reached them and gently offered the glass of water. "Ma'am, I thought you might like this." Evelyn looked at her with gratitude and accepted it. "Thank you." That is very thoughtful. Before Evelyn could take another sip, Nathaniel looked toward the ballroom entrance where several important guests had arrived. He straightened his jacket and turned back to Evelyn. They are here for the final reception. We should welcome them together. Evelyn looked at the water in her hand, then at Nathaniel. She placed the glass back on the table with a soft smile. Of course. Amara watched the exchange and felt a quiet sadness. Evelyn had chosen everyone else's comfort over her own all evening. The ballroom doors opened wider, and another round of applause welcomed the new arrivals. Nathaniel stepped forward to greet them. Evelyn followed beside him with perfect manners and gentle words. A little girl attending the event with her parents walked up to Evelyn and handed her a small flower from the centerpiece. The child smiled and said that it was for the baby. Evelyn laughed softly and thanked her. For a brief moment, the tired expression disappeared from her face. Amara smiled too. Nathaniel looked at the flower and then at Evelyn. The little moment of happiness was interrupted when another business associate called his name. Nathaniel immediately returned to the conversation and expected Evelyn to join him. The little girl looked up at Amara and quietly asked if the nice lady was all right. Amara knelt down and smiled. I think she could use a little kindness tonight. The child's mother heard the answer and looked toward Evelyn with understanding. One by one, small moments like that began to spread through the ballroom. The older woman offered Evelyn a chair again. The doctor quietly asked if she would like a quick check to make sure she felt comfortable. Grace Whitman arranged for a quieter place nearby if she needed to rest. For the first time that evening, people were beginning to notice that kindness did not have to wait for permission. Nathaniel looked around and seemed surprised by the attention gathering around his wife. Amara stood quietly with her silver tray and realized that something important was happening. The silence that had protected uncomfortable moments all night was beginning to disappear, and when Evelyn looked across the crowded ballroom and met Amara's eyes once again, there was a small, grateful smile on her face that seemed to say she was no longer carrying the evening by herself. Evelyn Royce looked around the ballroom and seemed surprised by the small circle of kindness that had quietly formed around her. The little girl smiled and waved before returning to her parents. The older woman gently offered her chair again. The doctor from the hospital foundation stood nearby and asked if she would like a few minutes to rest. Grace Whitman arranged for a quiet sitting area near the garden doors where fresh air and comfortable chairs waited for any guest who needed them. For the first time that evening, Evelyn did not seem completely alone. Amara Lewis watched from a respectful distance with her silver tray in her hands. She had not planned any of it. She had simply offered a glass of water and a smile. Somehow that simple act had given other people permission to care as well. Nathaniel Royce stood with a group of business leaders near the stage. He looked toward the gathering around Evelyn and frowned with confusion. One of the foundation directors quietly excused himself from the conversation and walked over to check on Evelyn. Another guest followed. Nathaniel slowly crossed the ballroom and stopped beside his wife. Is everything all right? He asked. The doctor smiled politely. Mrs. Royce has been working very hard this evening. We were simply making sure she was comfortable. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. You could have told me if you needed a break. Evelyn smiled gently. I tried a few times. Nathaniel opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. The words seemed to stay with him. Grace Whitman stepped forward with her usual calm professionalism. Mr. Royce, we have adjusted the schedule. There is no reason to rush the rest of the evening. Your wife can sit and relax as long as she would like. Nathaniel looked around the ballroom. More people were watching than he realized. Not with anger, not with judgment, simply with concern for Evelyn. Amara noticed something change in Nathaniel's expression. The confidence that had carried him through every business meeting and public event was suddenly replaced by uncertainty. He looked at the chair waiting for Evelyn. He looked at the untouched glass of water on the table. He looked at the little flower the child had given her. Then he looked at his wife. Evelyn sat down slowly and took a long breath. Thank you, she said to the doctor, to Grace, and to the older woman who had offered the chair. Nathaniel stood quietly beside her. The foundation director smiled at him. Family should come first. The business conversations can wait. Nathaniel nodded, but he did not answer right away. Amara carried a fresh pitcher of water to the sitting area and gently refilled Evelyn's glass. Evelyn looked up and smiled. You have been very kind to me tonight. Amara smiled back. Everyone deserves a little kindness, ma'am. Nathaniel heard the exchange. He looked at Amara for a long moment. as though trying to remember when he had first noticed the young waitress. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "I think I forgot how long this evening has been for you," he said quietly. Evelyn did not accuse him. She simply nodded. "It has been a long day for both of us." The words seemed to lift a weight from the room. The doctor suggested that Evelyn stay seated for the remainder of the event. Grace agreed immediately and adjusted the schedule again. Nathaniel looked toward the stage where another announcement was waiting to begin. Then he surprised everyone. He turned to the master of ceremonies and quietly asked for a few minutes before continuing the program. The audience waited patiently. Nobody complained. The little girl smiled when she saw Evelyn sitting comfortably with her glass of water. The older woman returned to her table looking relieved. Grace Whitman thanked the staff for their quick help. Amara stepped back into the crowd and picked up her silver tray once more. She realized that courage had spread across the ballroom in small and unexpected ways. One person had offered a chair. Another had offered medical advice. Someone else had offered understanding. Standing beneath the warm lights of the charity gala, Amara looked at Evelyn talking peacefully with Nathaniel and realized that sometimes the strongest voice in a crowded room is not the loudest one, but the quiet invitation for everyone to choose compassion instead of silence. Evelyn Royce sat quietly in the comfortable chair near the garden doors, holding the small flower the little girl had given her while the sounds of the charity gala continued around her. The grand ballroom of the Royal Crescent Hotel no longer felt quite as overwhelming. The doctor had assured her that a few moments of rest would do her good. Grace Whitman had adjusted the evening's schedule without hesitation. Guests who had spent the first part of the night pretending not to notice now stopped to ask if she needed anything. Amara Lewis watched from across the room with a silver tray in her hands and felt a quiet sense of relief. The kindness that had begun with one simple glass of water had somehow spread through the entire ballroom. Nathaniel Royce stood nearby, looking at his wife with a thoughtful expression. For most of the evening, he had focused on speeches, photographs, and business conversations. Now the room had changed around him. He had watched strangers offer Evelyn a chair before he thought to ask if she wanted one. He had watched a little girl hand his wife a flower simply because she cared. He had watched a young waitress quietly notice what so many important people had overlooked. Nathaniel walked over to Evelyn and knelt beside her chair so they could speak without the whole ballroom listening. "Are you feeling better?" he asked softly. Evelyn smiled. "I am. Thank you for asking." Nathaniel looked down for a moment. "I should have asked sooner." Evelyn reached for his hand. "It has been a long night." Nathaniel nodded. "I spent so much time trying to make everything perfect that I forgot the most important part of the evening was standing beside me." Evelyn's eyes filled with quiet happiness. Across the room, Grace Whitman smiled when she saw the conversation. The older woman who had offered Evelyn a chair smiled as well. Even the doctor looked satisfied that the evening had taken a better direction. Nathaniel stood and looked around the ballroom. Then he walked toward the stage and asked the master of ceremonies for one final moment before the event ended. The room grew quiet. Nathaniel looked at the audience and smiled. "Tonight we gathered to celebrate generosity and compassion. I thought those values belonged only in speeches and fundraising goals. I was wrong. I saw kindness from people who expected nothing in return. I saw strangers care for my family simply because it was the right thing to do." The ballroom answered with warm applause. Nathaniel looked toward Amara. "Miss Lewis, would you please come here for a moment?" Amara looked surprised. She glanced at her manager, who nodded with a smile. Carrying her silver tray, she walked toward the stage. Nathaniel thanked her in front of everyone. "You reminded all of us that paying attention to another person can change an entire evening." Amara smiled politely. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for my family." Evelyn stood and joined them. She took Amara's hand gently. "You made me feel seen tonight," she said. "I will always remember that." The audience applauded once more, not because of wealth or business success, but because simple kindness had become the most important story of the evening. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn and offered his arm. This time they walked together at a pace that was comfortable for her. The photographers quietly lowered their cameras and let the moment belong to the family instead of the headlines. Guests returned to their conversations with lighter hearts. Grace closed her event schedule with a satisfied smile. The little girl waved goodbye with her parents. Amara picked up her silver tray and returned to her work, knowing she had never asked for attention and never expected recognition. As the lights of New York shimmered beyond the ballroom windows and the evening finally came to an end, everyone who had witnessed the quiet events of that night carried home the same lesson. That true strength is measured by how gently we treat the people beside us. And sometimes the person who changes the whole room is simply the one who refuses to let kindness stay silent.